My fiancée told everyone that I ruined her perfect love story with my best friend during her wedding speech. So, I left her at the altar and cut all ties. Now, she's begging me for a second chance. I'll start by saying that I've always been someone who appreciates stability. I'm not the type to have a wide social circle, but I've always maintained solid relationships, my family, a couple of good friends, and most importantly, my best friend Jake. Jake is the kind of person who lights up any room he walks into, outgoing, funny, and charismatic. He always knows how to make others feel comfortable, which is why, since we were teenagers, he's been like a brother to me in many ways. Jake was the person I trusted the most. Our friendship started in high school, and over time, it became one of those unbreakable bonds. We shared so much, successes, failures, and moments that marked our lives. So, when I met Rachel, it was no surprise that Jake was one of the first people to know. For me, she was special from the very beginning, and I was excited that the two most important people in my life would finally meet. I met Rachel 3 years ago at a barbecue hosted by Jake. It was summer, the kind of day when everything seems to shine a little brighter. Rachel was there as a guest of a mutual friend, and from the moment our eyes met, I knew something big was about to happen. She had a smile that seemed to light up everything, and her laugh was contagious. We spent almost the entire night talking, and in the end, we exchanged numbers. When I told Jake about Rachel, he seemed excited for me. It was typical of him to be happy about the good things that happened to me. When I said I was planning to ask her out, he encouraged me, as he always did. From the beginning, Jake and Rachel seemed to get along well. I was glad to see that my best friend and my new girlfriend had such a positive connection. I never thought that connection could turn into something more. Rachel and I started dating shortly after the barbecue, and the relationship progressed quickly. We had so much in common. Our future plans, sense of humor, even small details like our shared love for the same kind of old movies. Rachel was someone who always seemed interested in improving and growing as a person, and that inspired me. I fell in love with her without a doubt. In the first year of our relationship, everything was perfect. Rachel and I spent time together, and Jake remained part of our dynamic as a good friend, organizing all kinds of things. I felt lucky to have those two people in my life, but over time, small things started to arise, things I now realize were warning signs. One of the first moments I felt something was off was during a dinner we had together. Rachel had made her famous lasagna, and as we were eating, Jake started joking with her about something that had happened in a message he had sent earlier. I didn't fully understand what they were talking about, but I noticed Rachel laughing in a different way, almost nervously. When I asked what it was about, they both quickly changed the subject. I thought it was just a silly thing, but that moment stuck in my mind. As time passed, I began to notice other things. Rachel and Jake exchanged inside jokes, which didn't bother me entirely, but I didn't understand. Sometimes Rachel mentioned Jake more than usual, saying things like, "Jake is so good at this," or, "Oh, Jake helped me with that." Although they were harmless comments, they started accumulating in my mind. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I decided to ignore it. By the second year of our relationship, I decided I wanted to take things to the next level. I planned to propose to Rachel, and as always, Jake was the first person I went to for advice. He helped me choose the ring and organize the proposal. In fact, he was the one who suggested I do it during a planned trip to the mountains. The proposal was perfect, and Rachel said yes with tears of happiness. I thought that would be the start of a bright future together. In the following months, we began planning the wedding. Rachel was excited, but not as much as I had expected. There were moments when she seemed distant, almost as if something was bothering her. When I asked if everything was okay, she always said she was just stressed about the preparations. I wanted to believe her. After all, organizing a wedding isn't easy. Jake continued to be an important part of our lives. He even offered to help with some of the wedding arrangements, which I thought was a kind gesture, though deep down there was something that kept bothering me. Every time Rachel and Jake were together, the atmosphere subtly changed. Sometimes I would find them talking in the kitchen in a lower tone than usual or sharing private laughs. When I saw them, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I didn't want to ruin what we had with my insecurities. The week before the wedding, there was a moment that should have made me react. Jake came to the house to help with some preparations, and while we were working, he mentioned something about how life changes after marriage. His tone was strange, almost as if he wanted to say something else. When I asked him what he meant, he shrugged and quickly changed the subject. Again, I decided not to pay attention to it. Finally, the wedding day arrived. I was excited, though also a little nervous. Everything was perfectly planned. The venue, the music, even the small details like the flowers Rachel had chosen with such care. But there was something about her I couldn't figure out. Her smile, although beautiful, seemed forced. I tried to convince myself it was just nerves. After all, it was a big day. The wedding day. It started like a dream come true. I woke up early, filled with excitement and nerves. Rachel and I had worked so hard to ensure every detail was perfect. The venue was stunning. An expansive garden surrounded by centuries-old trees and decorated with lights hanging like stars. Everything looked like it was straight out of a romantic movie. Jake arrived early that morning to help me get ready. As always, he had that relaxed, confident air that managed to calm me down. He joked about how clumsy I would probably look trying to dance the waltz later, but he also told me how proud he was of me. "Today is the beginning of your best chapter," he said, giving me a pat on the shoulder. Despite any doubts I might have had about Jake and Rachel, at that moment I felt grateful to have him there. When it was finally time for the ceremony, everything was perfect. Rachel looked spectacular in her wedding dress, and when she walked down the aisle towards me, I felt time slow down. As we exchanged vows, everything else faded away. In that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. I thought we were about to begin a life together filled with happiness. But things began to feel strange during the reception. After the ceremony, Rachel disappeared for a few minutes, saying she needed to touch up her makeup. I didn't think much of it as it seemed normal. Meanwhile, Jake was mingling with the guests, making sure everyone was enjoying themselves. When Rachel came back, I noticed her expression was different. She seemed distant, even a bit tense. I thought about asking her if everything was okay, but decided not to press. I assumed it was just nerves from the whole day. The reception went smoothly, and then it was time for the speeches. My father spoke first, giving a speech full of affection and pride. Then it was Jake's turn. He took the stage with a glass in hand, and as expected, he had everyone laughing with a couple of jokes before becoming more serious. "I want to say that this man here, my best friend, is the most loyal and noble person I know," Jake began, looking directly at me. "He's always been there for me, and there's no one in the world who deserves more happiness than him. Rachel, you're lucky to have him, but I also know he's very lucky to have found you. Congratulations to both of you." The speech was brief but heartfelt, and everyone applauded enthusiastically. I applauded too, grateful to have Jake as my friend. However, Rachel didn't seem as impressed. As Jake returned to his seat, she looked at him in a way I couldn't understand. It was a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and something I couldn't fully identify. I felt a small knot in my stomach, but I tried to ignore it. It was our special day, and I didn't want anything to ruin it. Later, while the music played and the guests danced Rachel, she approached me with an expression I couldn't interpret. "I need to say a few words," she said. "I thought it would be something nice, a little speech to thank our friends and family for being there." Without thinking much, I accompanied her to the stage and handed her the microphone. Rachel started in a calm tone. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," she said, looking at the audience. "This day means so much to us, and I feel lucky to have so many loved ones here." Up until that moment, everything seemed normal, but then her voice began to tremble. She paused, as if gathering strength to continue. "But I can't pretend anymore," she said, and suddenly the atmosphere in the room changed. People stopped talking, and all eyes were on her. I can't move forward without telling the truth. My heart began to race. I looked at Rachel, trying to understand what was happening, but before I could say anything, she continued. I know today should be the happiest day of my life, she said, looking down, but I can't lie. I can't marry someone without being honest with myself. She looked up, and to my horror, her gaze turned to Jake. For years, I've had feelings for someone else, she said, and in that moment, I felt like the ground was opening up beneath me. Jake, I've always been in love with you. There was a moment of absolute silence in the room. No one knew how to react. I felt like I couldn't breathe, as if someone had punched me in the chest. I looked at Jake, hoping for some kind of explanation, but his expression was one of complete shock. He seemed as stunned as I was. Rachel continued, as if she had been holding those words in for years. I tried to ignore it, I tried to move on, but I can't. Today, here in front of everyone, I had to tell the truth. I wanted to scream, stop her, do something to end this nightmare, but I was paralyzed. All I could do was watch as she destroyed what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The room erupted in whispers. Some guests were trying to understand what they had just heard, while others looked at me with compassion or discomfort. My mother, sitting in the front row, had her hand over her mouth, clearly horrified. Jake finally stood up and came over to me. I swear I didn't know anything about this, he whispered, but at that moment his words meant nothing to me. All I could feel was humiliation, anger, and betrayal. Rachel dropped the microphone and left the stage, disappearing into the crowd. Jake tried to follow her, but I stopped him. Let her go, I said coldly. This has nothing to do with you. Without saying another word, I left the room. Outside, the night was cold, but I didn't care. I walked aimlessly, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was filled with unanswered questions. How had this happened? How had I not seen the signs? I went straight to the hotel where I was staying, leaving behind the nightmare that had become my wedding. On the way, I received a flood of messages and calls from family and friends, but I couldn't face anyone at that moment. My phone buzzed nonstop, but I ignored it and tossed it on the bed. When I finally reached my room, all I could do was sit there in silence, while Rachel's words echoed over and over in my mind. I've always been in love with Jake. Each time I remembered it, it felt like a knife digging deeper into my chest. I never thought something like this could happen to me, especially from the people I trusted most. After a few minutes of complete silence, anger began to take over me. How could Rachel do this to me? And in front of everyone? More importantly, how blind had I been not to notice? I knew Jake and Rachel had always gotten along, but I never imagined that good understanding could mean something more. Jake tried calling me several times that night. I didn't answer any of his calls. I also received messages from Rachel, but I only read the first few words of one before blocking her. Please let me explain. I didn't want to hear any of their explanations. Nothing they could say would change what had just happened. She approached me with a sorrowful expression, but I could not be moved by her words anymore. What I say won't change what I've already done, she admitted. I've humiliated both of you, but above all, I've destroyed your trust. The next morning, I woke up with a severe headache. I wasn't sure if it was from lack of sleep or the flood of emotions I had been holding in. I looked at my phone and saw the missed calls piling up. My mom had sent a long message filled with worry, asking where I was and begging me to call her. My younger sister had also written, saying she was ready to beat up Rachel if I needed her to. Even my dad, who was usually more reserved, left me a voicemail saying that what Rachel had done was unacceptable and that he was on my side. I couldn't help but feel grateful for my family's support, but at that moment, I didn't want to face anyone. Finally, my mom insisted so much that I decided to respond to her. Jake's words came through the phone. I swear I didn't know anything about this. His voice sounded sincere, but I couldn't help but feel suspicious. How could you not know? I responded, trying to stay calm even though my voice trembled with the rage I was holding back. Rachel didn't say she just fell in love with you. She said she has been in love with you for years. Didn't you notice? Jake paused, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. Finally, he spoke. Honestly, I didn't know. We always got along, but I never thought it was more. If I had suspected anything, I would have said something, I promise. I wanted to believe him, but my mind was flooded with doubts. There were too many moments now that seemed to make more sense. The inside jokes, the looks, the times Rachel seemed to seek his attention more than mine. How had I missed all of this before? And now I asked him, what am I supposed to do with all of this? She ruined my wedding, humiliated me in front of everyone, and all because she's in love with you. How do you expect me to move forward from this? I don't know, he replied, his honesty hurting more than helping. But what I do know is that I don't want this to destroy our friendship. I'm here for you no matter what. I hung up without responding. As much as I wanted to believe in his support, I couldn't process what I felt for him in that moment. Jake had been my best friend for years, but now every time I thought of him, I associated him with Rachel's betrayal. 2 days after the disaster, I received an unexpected message from one of Rachel's brothers. He asked me to meet with her, saying that she was devastated and needed to explain what had happened. My first instinct was to refuse, but a part of me wanted answers. I needed to understand why she had done something so cruel. We met at a cafe far from the city, where I knew we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. When Rachel arrived, I could barely look at her. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying, but I felt no sympathy for her at that moment. All I could see was the woman who had destroyed my trust. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly, sitting down across from me. I didn't respond. I just waited for her to speak. I knew that whatever she said would have to be very convincing to change anything. Rachel took a sip of her coffee before speaking. "I know what I did was wrong," she said finally. "There's no excuse for what happened at the wedding, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" I asked, feeling my anger flare up again. "If you never wanted to hurt me, why humiliate me in front of everyone? Why didn't you tell me the truth before we got this far?" She approached me with a sorrowful expression, but I could not be moved by her words anymore. "What I say won't change what I've already done," she admitted. "I've humiliated both of you, but above all, I've destroyed your trust." The next morning, I woke up with a severe headache. I wasn't sure if it was from lack of sleep or the flood of emotions I had been holding in. I looked at my phone and saw the missed calls piling up. My mom had sent a long message filled with worry, asking where I was and begging me to call her. My younger sister had also written, saying she was ready to beat up Rachel if I needed her to. Even my dad, who was usually more reserved, left me a voicemail saying that what Rachel had done was unacceptable and that he was on my side. I couldn't help but feel grateful for my family's support, but at that moment, I didn't want to face anyone. Finally, my mom insisted so much that I decided to respond to her. Jake's words came through the phone. "I swear I didn't know anything about this." His voice sounded sincere, but I couldn't help but feel suspicious. "How could you not know?" I responded, trying to stay calm even though my voice trembled with the rage I was holding back. "Rachel didn't say she just fell in love with you. She said she has been in love with you for years. Didn't you notice?" Jake paused, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. Finally, he spoke. "Honestly, I didn't know. We always got along, but I never thought it was more. If I had suspected anything, I would have said something, I promise." I wanted to believe him, but my mind was flooded with doubts. There were too many moments now that seemed to make more sense. The inside jokes, the looks, the times Rachel seemed to seek his attention more than mine. How had I missed all of this before? And now I asked him, what am I supposed to do with all of this? She ruined my wedding, humiliated me in front of everyone, and all because she's in love with you. How do you expect me to move forward from this? "I don't know," he replied, his honesty hurting more than helping. "But what I do know is that I don't want this to destroy our friendship. I'm here for you no matter what." I hung up without responding. As much as I wanted to believe in his support, I couldn't process what I felt for him in that moment. Jake had been my best friend for years, but now every time I thought of him, I associated him with Rachel's betrayal. 2 days after the disaster, I received an unexpected message from one of Rachel's brothers. He asked me to meet with her, saying that she was devastated and needed to explain what had happened. My first instinct was to refuse, but a part of me wanted answers. I needed to understand why she had done something so cruel. We met at a cafe far from the city, where I knew we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. When Rachel arrived, I could barely look at her. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying, but I felt no sympathy for her at that moment. All I could see was the woman who had destroyed my trust. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly, sitting down across from me. I didn't respond. I just waited for her to speak. I knew that whatever she said would have to be very convincing to change anything. Rachel took a sip of her coffee before speaking. "I know what I did was wrong," she said finally. "There's no excuse for what happened at the wedding, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" I asked, feeling my anger flare up again. "If you never wanted to hurt me, why humiliate me in front of everyone? Why didn't you tell me the truth before we got this far?" Rachel took a deep breath, as if she were struggling to find the right words. "I didn't know how to tell you," she admitted. "I tried to ignore my feelings for Jake for years. I thought if I married you, I could get over it. But when the wedding day came, I just couldn't. To move on, I couldn't lie to myself or to you." Her words were like daggers. Not only had she used our relationship as an escape from her feelings for Jake, but she had waited for the worst possible moment to tell the truth. I felt a mix of anger and pain that was hard to describe. "So what do you want from me now?" I finally asked, looking her directly in the eyes. "Do you expect me to forgive you? Do you expect me to understand that you were confused?" Rachel looked down. "I don't expect anything," she said quietly. "I just wanted to apologize. I know there's no way to fix what I did, but I needed you to know how deeply sorry I am for hurting you." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to scream, to release all the pain I was feeling. But I knew it wasn't worth it. Rachel had made her decisions, and I needed to make mine. I stood up from the table, leaving her sitting there without looking back. I knew there was nothing else to say. That night, I made the decision to move forward with the annulment process. Rachel was not going to be part of my life anymore, and although I still had doubts about Jake, I knew the first thing I needed was distance. Several days passed since my encounter with Rachel, but the weight of everything that had happened was still crushing me. Messages from Rachel kept coming, even though I had blocked her on all social media. I realized I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. Every corner reminded me of Rachel. The table where we had dined so many times, the walls still adorned with pictures we had chosen together. I needed to get out of there and start over. That week, I decided to take some time off from work and drive to a cabin my parents owned in the mountains. It was a place that had always brought me peace, far away from the noise and complications of daily life. I needed it now more than ever. As I drove, my thoughts were a whirlwind. I couldn't stop wondering if Jake had been completely honest with me. I wanted to believe him when he said he didn't know about Rachel's feelings, but my mind kept returning to those moments when they seemed too close. Inside jokes, the looks that now took on new meaning. Even though he insisted he hadn't reciprocated those feelings, the doubt lingered like slow-acting poison. When I arrived at the cabin, I felt relieved by the silence that surrounded me. There were no signs of the life I had left behind, only the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird's song. I spent the first few days simply existing, walking through the woods, reading old books, and trying to find some clarity amid the chaos. However, the peace didn't last long. On the 4th day, I received an unexpected call. It was Jake. For a moment, I considered not answering, but there was something in his insistence. The fact that he had kept calling me even after I had ignored him for days. That made me think maybe he had something more to say. Finally, I picked up the phone. "What do you want, Jake?" I asked, my tone dry, with none of the familiarity I used to have when speaking to him. Please listen to me, he said quickly, as if afraid I would hang up on him. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I need you to know something, Jake continued. I've been thinking about all of this, about Rachel, about what happened, and I think there's something else you need to know. I frowned, feeling a mix of curiosity and distrust beginning to form inside me. Something else? What do you mean? Jake paused, as if gathering strength to speak. She contacted me a few days ago, he confessed finally. She sent me a message saying she wanted to talk, that she needed to clear things up. My heart raced. And what did you do? I asked, my voice louder than I had intended. I didn't respond, Jake quickly added. I want you to know I don't want anything with her. I never did. But I think you need to know that she's still insisting, not just with you, but with me too. I felt like my stomach twisted. I couldn't believe Rachel had the audacity to try to contact Jake after everything that had happened. But at the same time, I didn't know what to think about Jake telling me this now. Was it because he wanted to be honest, or was there something else behind it? So, why are you telling me this? I finally asked. What do you expect me to do with this information? Because I want you to know that I'm on your side, Jake replied, his voice filled with urgency. I know what happened at the wedding was a disaster, and I understand you're angry with me, but I never wanted to hurt you, and I would never do anything to betray you. I want to help you get through this, if you'll let me. His words hit me like a wave. Part of me wanted to believe him, to regain that connection we had shared for so many years, but another part, the one that was still hurt, couldn't ignore the doubts that had piled up since the wedding. I need time, I said finally. I don't know if I can trust you the way I did before, but I appreciate that you told me this. Jake seemed to accept my response, although his tone reflected a mix of relief and sadness. I understand, he said. I just want you to know that I'm here if you need anything. After hanging up, I sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what I had just heard. Jake said he was on my side, but could I trust that? Could I move past the doubts and rebuild our friendship after everything that had happened? While I was trying to decide how to handle the situation with Jake, I received another unexpected blow. My sister called to tell me something she had heard from one of the wedding guests. Apparently, Rachel had started telling a completely different version of events. According to her, I was the one who had misunderstood her words during the speech. She's saying that she wasn't in love with Jake, my sister said, clearly furious. She says she was just expressing admiration for him, and that you overreacted. I felt my blood boil. How could Rachel have the nerve to say something like that? Did she think she could erase what she had said in front of everyone just by changing the narrative? It's a lie, I said, my voice full of anger. Everyone heard what she said. She can't just make up another version of the events. I know, my sister replied, but I wanted you to know what she's saying. People are starting to question what really happened. This new twist made me realize that I realized something important. I couldn't let Rachel control the narrative. I had been publicly humiliated, but I wasn't going to let her distort the facts to save her reputation. That night, I decided it was time to return. I couldn't stay isolated in the cabin while Rachel tried to manipulate the situation. I needed to confront her, confront Jake, and face the consequences of everything that had happened. But I also knew I had to do it carefully. I wanted to make sure my version of the story was clear, without leaving room for misunderstandings. The first thing I did when I got back was talk to my parents. I told them everything I knew, including what Jake had confessed about Rachel's attempts to contact him. Their reactions were of anger and support. I knew that no matter what, they would be on my side. After that, I started reaching out to some of the wedding guests, people I knew might have heard the rumors. I wanted to make sure they understood exactly what had happened, leaving no space for Rachel's lies. As I began to rebuild my life, I also realized that I needed to resolve what I felt about Jake. I couldn't continue living with doubt. I knew that sooner or later, I would have to make a decision about our friendship. Back in the city, I realized that I couldn't just go back to my life as if nothing had happened. The weight of the events from the wedding was still there, but I also knew I couldn't let that experience define the rest of my life. I needed definitive answers, and more importantly, closure for everything that had happened. I decided to start with Jake. Our friendship had been one of the most important constants in my life, and if there was any chance of saving it, I needed to confront our doubts and differences face to face. Jake and I met at a park near my house. It was a quiet place, perfect for such a delicate conversation. When he arrived, he looked tired, almost as worn out as I felt. He sat silently for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for coming," he said finally. "I know you have a lot of questions. I want to be completely honest with you because this friendship means too much to me to let it end like this." I nodded, though I kept a certain emotional distance. "I just need to know one thing, Jake," I started. "Did you ever return Rachel's feelings or suspect she was in love with you before the wedding?" Jake immediately shook his head. "I never returned her feelings. And to be honest, I never suspected she was in love with me. I thought we were just close friends, and I always assumed she was as committed to you as you were to her." He paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "But looking back, there are things that now seem more obvious. How she would seek my attention. The times she insisted we hang out even when you weren't around. I think I just didn't want to see it. I didn't want to imagine that something like that could be true. I wanted to believe her. Her sincerity seemed genuine, and her tone was full of regret. More than excuses, but I still had doubts." "Then why didn't you tell me anything when you noticed those signs?" I asked, my voice full of frustration. "Maybe all of this could have been avoided." Jake sighed, lowering his gaze. "Because I never thought it was something serious. And because I didn't want to ruin what you had with her. I knew how much you loved her and I didn't want to get in the middle. Now I realize it was a mistake." We fell silent for a moment, letting his words settle. Finally, I decided I needed to make a choice. I could hold on to resentment and doubts, or I could try to rebuild what was left of our friendship. "I want to believe in you, Jake," I said finally. "But it's going to take time. This isn't something that can be fixed overnight." Jake nodded, a look of relief mixed with sadness on his face. "I understand. I'm willing to wait as long as you need." With that, we left the conversation there. It wasn't complete closure, but it was a step forward. In the meantime, the rumors that Rachel had started kept spreading. Several people began to contact me, some offering their support, others wanting to hear my side of the story. Although it bothered me that I had to defend myself, I decided it was better to clear things up directly. I arranged an informal meeting with some close friends and family members who had been at the wedding. I told them exactly what had happened, including Rachel's confession and how she tried to change the narrative afterward. I also mentioned her attempt to contact Jake, making sure they understood that he hadn't returned her feelings. My mother, who had been furious from the start, took the opportunity to make it clear that our family wouldn't tolerate any attempt by Rachel to defame me. "She lost her chance to explain herself when she decided to humiliate you in public," she said. "Now she's just trying to save her reputation, but we all know what really happened." Fortunately, most people understood my version and sympathized with me. Even those who had initially doubted began to see Rachel in a new light. Over time, the rumors died down, although I knew they would never disappear completely. A few days later, I received an email from Rachel. She had tried to contact me in many ways, but until then, I had ignored all her attempts. However, this time, I decided to read it. I wanted to know what else she had to say before closing that chapter forever. The message was long and full of apologies. Rachel admitted that she had handled everything in the worst possible way, but she also insisted that she had never meant to hurt me. She said that her confession at the wedding had been a spur-of-the-moment thing, and that now she deeply regretted it. But what caught my attention the most was one particular line: "I hope that someday you can forgive me, but I also understand if you never do. I just want you to know that I always wanted the best for you, even if I miserably failed to show it." For a moment, I considered replying, but in the end I decided not to. There was nothing more to say. Rachel had made her choices, and I had made mine. The best thing for both of us was to move forward on separate paths. The following months were a process of rebuilding. I started focusing on my work, my friends, and my family. Although there were still days when the memories of the wedding haunted me, I slowly began to feel more like myself again. Jake and I continued talking. Although our friendship was never quite the same, there was a distance between us that hadn't existed before. But we were both committed to rebuilding what we could. Most importantly, I learned to set boundaries and trust my instincts. If anything good came from this experience, it was that I understood the value of surrounding myself with people who truly respect and value me. Thank you for making it this far. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your comments saying what you thought. A kiss, and see you in the next video.